בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב. We are finished with Hanukkah and back to the 20th century. So we should have a mind jump now of 2 millennia. And we speak today about someone who is very famous on the one hand, but very interestingly, his name, for some reason which I really don't understand. I just spoke with my mother, who was a history teacher for decades. She's now 25. Uh, but so I spoke with her, and Esther, it's only me not remembering learning on Rav Meir Bar Ilan for in our the tzionut. We learned tzionut for a year or two, I think, in high school in Israel. And she told me, no, you're right. He's not in the curriculum at all. And he was extremely pivotal and important in the reshaping, in the shaping of the Mizrahi movement and religious Zionism in Israel and in the United States, which I didn't even know until I prepared this shiur. So a very important figure, very interesting, and at least it would be somewhat of a compensation, not for him, he doesn't need it, but for us and for our lack of education. I shouldn't speak about you, I speak about myself. So my lack of education on knowing about Rav Meir Bar Ilan. So who was he and from where did he come? Rav Meir Bar Ilan was born as Rav Meir Berlin. Berlin. He later Hebraized his name, but he was born in Volozhin to a very prestigious family. His father was the Natziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the legendary, the famous, world-famous Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. Volozhin was the most important yeshiva in the Lithuanian world, and the Natziv was a Rosh Yeshiva there for decades. And when Rab Meir Berlin was born to the second wife of the Natziv, had first wife, and had a few children from her. And then he had the second, and then she passed away. And he remarried to a woman, Bat Yareina, who was herself coming from a very important family. She was the daughter of the Aruch HaShulchan, of Yechiel Michal Levi Epstein, another very important personality. So the Natziv was already 64 when Meir Berlin was born. And so he was a Ben Zekunim, right? He was his youngest son. And the family was accepted, was seen as a type of a royal house. It was the royal dynasty of the Lithuanian Jews. And as the Lithuanian Jews saw themselves as the most important Jews in the world, I apologize, but that's what they had. So it was clear to them that this is the nobility of the Jewish world. It's only Lithuanians who call the rabbis Rashka Bahag, Rabban Shel Kol Bnei Agola, the head rabbi of all of the exiles. Now, it may be that outside of Lithuania, no one would pay any heed. At least not the rabbis would be respected, but would not be seen as the last word, neither for the Hasidim, and nor for, especially not for Sephardic Jews all over the world, but they would still be called by the Lithuanians the rabbis of the whole world, Rashka Bahag. And it is to this day an interesting phenomenon. So the family was seen as the royal family of the Lithuanian world. I think that's the Berlin family. We have to remember they were also related to Reb Chaim Brisker, because the granddaughter of the Natziv, but from his first marriage. So the granddaughter was older than the son we are now speaking about. So the granddaughter of the Natziv was married to Reb Chaim Brisk. So in a strange way, Reb Meir Berlin, our hero, was the uncle, even the great uncle, of Reb Chaim Brisker, although Reb Chaim Brisker was older than him in 30 or 40 years. So that's just the quirks of... It's confusing. That's what happens when people remarry much younger wives in an older age, but Yeah, okay, that seems to be even stranger. Okay, so that's the biography. It tells he has a memoir. He has it's not really an autobiography. It's more of his memories that he writes about other people that he met and that he knew, and it was important for him to describe or situations. It's called From Volozhin to Yerushalayim. It was printed. It was written in Yiddish. It was written in Yiddish as separate articles to journals, to newspapers. And later it was collected into a book in Yiddish. And then it was translated to Hebrew. And I believe there is also an English version. Highly, highly recommended. Very interesting. It doesn't tell you too much about him because it's only what he remembers. Sometimes he tells stories about himself, but he tells it as it happened to someone else. And only when I read about him in biographies, I was able to understand that what he writes in his memoir is really his experiences, not he's telling about someone else. So that's part of, I guess, of his humbleness. He writes in his memoir, let's see it inside, because I copied it. You can please give it away. So again, he was born in 1880. I didn't say that. He was born in 1880, as I said, in Voložhin. And he speaks here about the yeshiva was burned down when he was very young. The building was burned to the ground. As happened in Europe many times, they like to build from wood because it was cheap and it's good as insulation. Thank you. So they like to build from wood. There can be many problems with wood, but one of the major one of wood is that it burns very easily. And that caused many times that in Europe, in the small cities, in the big cities, some fires are very well known. The fire in London, very famous. The whole city would be burned down before you were able to extinguish the fire. So it happened also in Voložhin. Almost all of the city was burned to the ground, including the yeshiva. And they decided to rebuild the yeshiva as even in a bigger building and a stone building. It would be a beautiful building. But that was very good. It was very nice, a beautiful building. The problem was that now it catch the eye of the Russian government. You speak about the Tsarist government, very totalitarian, very authoritarian, and they didn't like the Jews raising their heads too much. Now, that was very stupid from them because the Jews, the Orthodox Jews, were, I think, the most loyal Jews to the Tsarist regime. Neither the Russians were so loyal, they toppled down the Russian regime, and not the others. So the non-Orthodox Jews were also, they were socialists, many of them were revolutionists. But the Orthodox Jews were the most loyal, I really think so, they were the most loyal citizens of the Tsar, but because they were so anti-Semitic, they couldn't, even what was for their own benefit, they couldn't understand. So they were very troubled with the Jews raising their head and building such a beautiful stone building for the yeshiva, and young Jews would come from all over Europe. Who knows what ideas they would bring with them? So they were very troubled with this new yeshiva building. And in this memoir, Volozhin to Yerushalayim, so in source Aleph, he describes how some officers came to ask questions, to sniff around when they were building the yeshiva. And they asked to be shown the plans. And the yeshiva was built from a very big learning hall, and next to it was a small room. Now, the small room was used, he tells, for one purpose was for the mashgiach to speak with a student, and you needed a private room. And also, he says, the women of the royal house, that's how they called it. The women of the royal house, it was the Ezrat Nashim, basically. So they would come to daven there. So when they asked the builder, who was a simple Jew, so they asked him, what is the small room used for? Because immediately they were suspicious. Why do you need small rooms? That's authority. And we are so far, I think, in thinking from these regimes. But they would look at the plan, at the bidding plan, and they would ask themselves, why do they need a small room? It's surely there is something suspicious going on. So they asked, why do you need a small room? And the builder said, that's for the women of the royal house. And the Russian officer that was asking the question was immediately, he was bewildered. How can you speak about a royal house? Is there part of a plan maybe to rebel against the Tsar? Because here the Jews are having their own royal house that they are hoping to overturn the regime with it. And they arrested, so it tells in the story, they arrested the builder. And they needed to bribe the Russian officers in order to get him out of this trouble that he dug to himself. But that's how they spoke. They spoke, that was just a simple way they spoke. They spoke about the nobility and the royal house of the Jews. Which was, so that's the way that this child is growing up. It's very important for me to emphasize it. I think I spoke about it a few times. And that is that in these families, which for generations were families of rabbis and of Jewish leaders. So children growing up in this atmosphere, they immediately understood that that's part of their mission, to take responsibility, to assume the mantle of the leaders of the next generation. Now, again, we are living in very different atmosphere. The general atmosphere is very different. That's also, we think. We live in at least in ideal, in a meritocracy. Help me here. Meritocracy, thank you. Meaning that everyone is equal. It doesn't matter who your father or your mother is. Just come to the, let's say, the yeshiva, if you speak about the Jewish world. Come to the yeshiva. If you are good, then regardless of who is your father, at least in ideal, many times it does happen, then you can become the next Rosh Yeshiva. And if you are less good, and even if you are the son of the Rosh Yeshiva, then again, at least in ideal, then you'd find your way out. And that's how the general world, again, in ideal is built. So in university, suppose it's the same thing, right? It doesn't matter if you're the son of the rector. The only thing that should matter is how good you are. I wouldn't send you to check how many of exactly the professors are from families. But, let's see. But also in the yeshivot, we should admit that it may be that it's not as it is being presented. However, that's at least the ideal. But back then, in the general world and also in the Jewish world, things were looked differently. Just as the Tsar, it was clear that he is the leader of his people, and also that his son would be the leader of the people. So if you are the Rosh Yeshiva, then it's only natural, if your son is not a complete useless, then it's only natural that he would fill your place. Why not? So you would, and there are some advantages to this view of things, because you would grow up in such an atmosphere in which you know that is your responsibility. You would be taught and be directed and have also, we may say, organizational memory of how to run such a complicated system as a big yeshiva as Volodzhin was, because if you just bring someone from the outside, it doesn't know how to, it needs to reinvent the wheel. But if it is someone that grew in the house of the Rosh Yeshiva and it's already the fourth generation, then then it can work out nicely. And by the way, if the children are not necessarily the most suitable candidates to lead the yeshiva, you can always choose someone as a chatan for your daughter. That can also work. What is good in a son-in-law is that you can choose him. I mean, at least back then. I'm not saying that now, but at least back then, you could choose your son-in-law. So that was also a possibility that things would stay in the family, but still you'd have some control over who is going to inherit you. Be it as it may, that's how Meir Berlin was raised. And for him, the yeshiva was his world. He tells again in his memoir, he says, I couldn't understand that there are families in which you do not celebrate Seder Pesach with 200 students. Back then, the students would remain for Pesach. That's how Pesach is being celebrated. What is a Seder Pesach if you do not have all of this? Now, I can, in some way, I think anyone that was in yeshiva, attended yeshiva for a long time, then he can understand it because you, not Pesach, because nowadays Pesach is not being celebrated in the yeshiva, but Purim. After you are getting used to celebrate Purim in yeshiva, it's really very difficult to readjust yourself to Purim in the community. It's a different beast. It's a different thing. You can say it has its own advantages, and it may have, but it's a different thing. So someone that grew up in the yeshiva, that's how Shabbat should look like. With 300 boys coming to the house of the Rosh Yeshiva singing Shabbat songs. So it's a different atmosphere than I would guess most of us grew up with. And all of that was beautiful, and he has the memoir, its first 150 pages are about the Volodzhin Yeshiva, which closed down when he was 12. So just to understand what volume the yeshiva took in his personality and the development of his personality. So the yeshiva was closed by the Russian government when he was 12. There were many reasons why it was closed, but two main ones. One is outside pressure by the Russian government that instead of having a yeshiva, it would become basically a high school with Russian learning and secular learning, which the Naziv was willing to accept to a limited degree, but what the Russian government really wanted was to completely take control over the curriculum, and that he was not able to do. It would not be a yeshiva anymore, especially not the Volozhin yeshiva, what was the type model for all of the other yeshivot. If it would fall, then all the other yeshivot would fall. That's at least how they felt. So he had to accept the judgment and to close the yeshiva. But also, as we know now even more, part of the problem was the internal fights within the yeshiva about who would be the successor of the Naziv. And as part of these internal fights, they turned to the Russian government in order to pressure, but instead of having pressure of who would be the next yeshiva, the pressure caused the Russians. When you open the door for them, then they try to completely overtook the yeshiva, which, by the way, unfortunately, it's not the first time, not the last time that it happened in our history, that one faction thought that by turning to external help, then it would have its own will dominate. But what happened in the end is that the external force that you invite completely take control, and the whole house is burning down on its inhabitants, and that's what happened then. And the yeshiva was closed, as I said, when the Naziv was 76, and it was a devastating blow because the Naziv saw the Volozhin yeshiva as the inheritance that was given to him to keep and to guard, and he dedicated 50 years of his life to the development of the yeshiva. And its closure was just the destroying of everything that he worked for throughout all of his life. And he became very sick. Also, he was left with very heavy debts that he took upon himself for the sake of the yeshiva. So as long as there was a yeshiva, then every year he would raise additional funds. He would pay the debts of last year and have and take new debts for the new year. But now that the yeshiva was closed, he just was left with there was no how it's called amuta back then that was incorporated, and I mean, he was personally obligated to pay the debt, which was very far from being able to do. He very seldom even took salary from the yeshiva because of the financial situation. As I said, all of his life were dedicated to the yeshiva. He didn't separate between him and the yeshiva. So when the yeshiva was closed, it was like for him, part of him died. And you can imagine how difficult it was for the son to see his great father that was adored, was put on a pedestal for thousands of students, and suddenly his father is a broken man. And the Naziv decided to leave וולוז'ין. The Naziv said, I want to go לעשות עלייה, I want to make עלייה to ארץ ישראל. Because as Rav Berlin, as Rav Meir bar Ilan describes, that was the two loves of his life, that he was never able to settle together because he needed to be in וולוז'ין for the yeshiva, to manage the yeshiva, and that's what stopped him from making aliyah. But now he said, the yeshiva is closed, at least I would make aliyah. But he was so sick and so broken that he was stopped in Warsaw in the way and was not able to complete the journey. Look at source Bet. He describes his father. That's from page 187 of his memoirs. We are already in page 187. It's only 12. 13. It was a year after the closure of the yeshiva. שתי הסגולות, he says, אהבה ללא גבול אל התורה והכמיהה העצומה לארץ ישראל. These were the two main character lines of my father. The boundary, no boundaries, love of Torah, and his desire, deep desire to come to Eretz Israel. Torah and the land of Israel. שכיננו בלב אבא ז"ל כל ימי חייו לא יכלו להתגשם בזמן אחד, but he couldn't fulfill them both at the same time, because the leadership of the וולוז'ין yeshiva took all of his forces, the physical ones and the spiritual ones, and regardless of all of his strong desire to settle in Eretz Israel, he couldn't do both together, both to manage the yeshiva in וולוז'ין and to settle in Eretz Israel. But after the yeshiva ceased to exist, then came the time of the idea and the will that already was there many years before. But the internal feeling of my father ז"ל, he says, שאל כל הסובבים אותו הייתה קשה מאוד, but everyone felt very, very miserable. קשה היה להכיר ולה, it was very difficult to know, כי מוולוז'ין יצאנו, we went out from וולוז'ין, ולארץ ישראל איננו באים. But he was not able to complete his journey and come to Eretz Israel. He called this memoir of his From וולוז'ין to Yerushalayim. And that's, I think, it's a very important, this paragraph is very important understanding who Rav Meir bar Ilan was. He was the man that wanted to complete the journey of his father from וולוז'ין to Yerushalayim. And not only the geographical places, but to reconnect the Torah of Chutz that for 2,000 years was learned in Chutz La'aretz and bring it to Eretz Israel. And so to replant the Torah in Eretz Israel and also to build Eretz Israel in light of the Torah. And combining these two together for him was the mission of his life, more or less from now on, from the age of 12. Of course, many things would solidify as time went by, but it's very clear that the seeds were planted when he saw his father dying, this agony of his life mission destroyed in וולוז'ין and not being able to come to Eretz Israel. So that was in 1893. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהכל נהיה בדברו. Now, he's still a young boy, 12 years old. He had a bar mitzvah just a few months before his father passed away. He says the bar mitzvah was a very quiet one. They couldn't celebrate. His father was very sick. So they had a very quiet bar mitzvah. It tells a heartbreaking story that in his drasha, so he was the son of the Naziv, he was a genius, and he gave a drasha in which he used one of the sefarim of the Naziv. And the Naziv was already very sick. He was crying when he gave the drasha, and he told his son, today I wouldn't have been able to write what you just gave in your drasha. I'm not able anymore. It's a very heartbreaking story. So, and he explains how much it was difficult for his father, everything that happened from the time of the closure of the yeshiva. After his father's passing, then obviously the boy needs to continue in land because, as I said, he is designated, is destined, destined, yeah, to become the next Torah leader of Am Israel. So he begins the journey through Europe in the best of Europe Torah teaching places to learn more Torah. And I don't have time to go through all of the places because his life was so full of events that we need to shorten. Two main places that I want just to mention in passing. One was by, as I said, his nephew, Reb Chaim Brisk, which was much older than he was, and was a very important Torah scholar, extremely. Reb Chaim of Brisk, I think we had a shiur about him, extremely important Torah scholar, and he stayed with him for a few years. And now he and Reb Chaim were extremely different. The Netziv was very different from Reb Chaim. The Netziv was a man of width, of being interested in everything in the world, reading newspapers. Reb Chaim Brisk was a man of one thing, Torah. Nar Torah. That was the only Torah. That was the sisma, right? The motto, yeah, of the Brisker Rav. And so they were very different in this regard. However, of course, Torah, he could learn from him. And also, very interesting, again, in this memoir is a few beautiful chapters about Reb Chaim of Brisk. And he says he was very extreme in his opinions, but he knew how to differentiate between the opinions and the human being. It's very interesting. And he says he was an extremist of the extremists, קיצוני שבקיצוניים. But he would be respectful towards every and any person, even if he was very far from his opinions. He would fight for his opinions, bitterly. But he would respect the person, and he would not punish people for their opinions, only for their actions, if their actions required punishments, but not for opinions. Very, very interestingly. And he says, I learned it from him. And that's why it's so interesting. So what was the thing that he learned from Reb Chaim of Brisk? Sovlanut. Almost, I would say, pluralism. Now, that's, of course, it's ridiculous, but that's what he saw there in Reb Chaim of Brisk. Later, he continued to go to learn with his grandmother from his mother's side. Grandfather, excuse me, from his mother's side, from his maternal side, right? That's, as I said, the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Chiel Michal Epstein, a very important rabbi, which I'm sorry about not teaching about him when you spoke about the 19th century, but you know, there were so many rabbanim, so we wanted to continue. But now I have charata. Regret, exactly. So Rav Epstein was a very important rabbi. A Paskan, he wrote the Aruch HaShulchan, which is being used to this day. It's like a rival to the Mishnah Berurah. But what he was, again, famous for, and Rav Meir Bar Ilan writes about it in his memoir, says he was a person that saw things clearly as they are, and was very confident in what he thought was correct. So if he was lenient with something, then he was lenient. He gives the mashal, he says, when you are a doctor, you are a chirurg, surgeon, you're a surgeon, then you have you need to have two qualities. One is to be able to call things as they are, just the theory. You have to understand what do you see and what is the right solution. And B, you need to have the confidence that you can operate according to your solution. He says many rabbis are very good in the theory, so they can analyze. But when they need to give the psak, they are yerei ora. They fear to be too lenient, and they take a step backward. And his grandfather was, when he wanted to be machmir, he was machmir. But when he wanted to be lenient, he was a lenient. And he didn't fear to call spade a spade, to do things as he understood are correct. And that's what he took from him. This self-confidence that you are, now again, you hear everyone, you try to listen, you try to understand, but then you come to your conclusion and you operate according to your conclusion. And if it may sometimes cause problems or cause disputes, then so that's part of life. That's part of life. And you never feared, I think he even liked a good polemic. That he would write. He was very sharp, he had a very sharp pen. Now, very nice always. He didn't attack personally. That's what he learned from Reb Chaim of Brisk. But he didn't shy from attacking opinions that he thought were incorrect. So these were we may say, his three models. One, the primary one, was his father, the Netziv, and also his nephew, Reb Chaim of Brisk, and his grandfather, Rav Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan. Now, in the age of 20, he marries, and his wife was Bila Rabinovich, and he is joining the Mizrahi. Because, as I said, he came to the conclusion that what he needs to do, his mission in life, is to connect Torah with the land. And the organization, the party, the political party that calls for the unification of Torah and Eretz is the Mizrahi. Now, the Mizrahi was very new. The Mizrahi was founded in 1902, and in 1905, he was already a tzir, a delegate of the Mizrahi to the 7th Zionist Congress. And already in there, he made waves. He was very young, but although he was from the Mizrahi, the 7th Zionist Congress, I should maybe say, was a very bitter one, because one, it was the first after the death of Herzl, and B, second, it was under the question of Uganda. Now, that's a very complicated story that I think some of you may know, and also we don't have the time to get into, but in very, very crude lines, the people that were in favor of the Uganda program said, we need to create a safe haven even for a short time. And if it be Uganda, may it be Uganda, because Jews are being persecuted mostly in Russia. And we need to give them a safe haven. And the other Zionists said, no, if you would give up on Eretz Israel, it would never be given to us. We must stay focused on the mission and not go astray. And the Mizrahi, maybe it would come as a surprise to some of us, the Mizrahi was in favor of the Uganda. Rav Reines was in favor of the Uganda program for two reasons. One, that was just a practical solution. And Rav Reines was extremely practical man. So he said, if Jews need to be saved and Uganda is the place, then let it be Uganda. And second, Rav Reines was very appreciative, and also some others of the Mizrahi heads of the time, they really appreciated Herzl and his Pamalia and his circle. So if Herzl was in favor, now he already died, as I said, but he was in favor of the first stages of the Uganda program, then the Mizrahi would go with the Uganda program. And Rav Meir Bar Ilan would not hear about it. He said, we want to go to Eretz Israel not only for reasons of material or even for saving lives. We want to go to Eretz Israel because Eretz Israel is part of the Jewish soul. So nothing should distract us from aiming ourselves to Eretz Israel. In the end, the proposal of Uganda was rejected in this Congress. Now, judging from more than 100 years later, it's very difficult to make a call. Also, it may be that the whole thing was not practical to begin with. The British were known for giving things that they didn't own. And yeah, that's just what they did. That's what they did with the Jordanians, right here. It was part of the Jewish homeland that they gave from the eastern of the Jordan. Also, Uganda didn't belong to them. So what gave them the right to propose? That's the whole thing, but that's what they did. That's the same thing. I apologize for those of us that may feel connected to the British, but anyone that would go to the British Museum, how many artifacts in the British Museum were produced by British people?
No, but Uganda, it was a British colony.
Yeah, I understand, but it doesn't give them the right to give it to someone.
And they cannot manage it. That's why
the
idea was to put Jews.
I understand their interests. The question is, what would the Ugandians say about that? Who cared, right? So it maybe the whole thing was completely impractical. But if it was, one cannot but wonder, I guess that here I betray my practical leanings. Maybe it could have said hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Jews. Who knows? You don't think so? It's a practical question that, again, it's very difficult to be. They call it a Monday quarterback, right? Someone that plays. What? Monday morning quarterback, right? You played the game after it was already played, so now you know what should have been the right moves. Maybe, who knows? He opposed the Uganda program, and against the majority opinion in the Mizrahi itself. So at the age of 20-something, he was already very much a self-made man who, as I said, was confident in what he was doing, and didn't shy from a good dispute. In 1910, he comes to Germany. Now, it's very difficult to know why did he come there. I read there are two biographies. I think one very big. The other is only 120 pages. In both of them, I couldn't find a hint. I think that he liked to travel. He did also an organizational work for the Mizrahi, but many people did and stayed in their place. And I think he wanted to learn. He wanted to know the Jewish people. So all of his life, he was traveling all around. And he came to Germany, and he was amazed with what we would call today modern Orthodoxy. Because he grew up in Russia, he knew a certain type of Orthodoxy, and he comes to Berlin, and suddenly he sees people that are professors. He writes that. He says, it was amazing for me to see someone that is a professor, a very cultural man, but never misses a mincha. And it took time to realign his thoughts, but from there on he became, you may say, a modern Orthodox. In a sense, in a specific sense, not in the Germanic sense, but in a specific sense that maybe we are more familiar with. And he arranges Mizrahi in Germany. He becomes the head of Mizrahi in Germany. Later, he becomes the head of worldwide Mizrahi because he is very active. He speaks, he writes, he always has ideas, and he implements. He is a man of actions, he's a man of words, but also a man of actions. And his ichus open doors, because no one would say no to the son of the Natziv. So he is going from place to place. He is raising funds for the Mizrahi. He is making a people for the Mizrahi. And so the Ashkaf of the Mizrahi was, we want to be part of the Zionist organization and make it as religious as we can. It's very difficult to say. There were Eastern European Orthodox Jews. So yes, they were yeshivish in the sense that all of you Eastern European Jews, Lithuanians, not Hasidic, were yeshivish. But when we say today yeshivish in the American world, it means, I think it's per definition, it's not Mizrahi. So we need to try to go back 100 years in our imagination. Now, what was interesting is that in Germany, the Orthodox, and their Orthodox were not yeshivish, they were Orthodox. And they were the one they didn't invent the term is Christian, but they were the one to apply the term to Judaism. So they were Aguda. That's something also hard for us to wrap our head today. But Aguda was founded by the modern Orthodox people of Germany. and not by the Eastern European yeshiva world, because the Eastern European yeshiva Jews were not up to any organizational work. They were just traditional. You needed the forces of Germany, Jews, in order to create the framework for the Aguda to be developed. So that's just an interesting side note. And he lands there and he tries to convince people to go Mizrahi. Some, of course, he was able to convince many, but many others did not. The famous successor of Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, that's Dr. Yitzhak Breuer, very famous Jewish thinker and a rabbi, and the leader of the Frankfurt community. And he was an Aguda. He was, again, one of the founders of Aguda, yes.
So where does Israel come into this? Were they Zionist or they were just...
They were Zionist, but in the 1910s, being a Zionist meant speak a lot and do little. That you know what, I'm taking it back because it was too sharp. Their abilities were very limited. We have to remember it's before the Balfour Declaration. It's before the British conquest of Palestine. Herzl's plan was to speak with the Sultan and convince him to give the land to the Jews and having some type of an autonomy, which if the Sultan had any mind, I think that was a great plan for him. But as I said, anti-Semitism, it's a pathological disease. It causes people to act against their self-interest. That's what happened in Russia, that's what happened in Turkey, and that's what happened in Germany. And it's happening now. That's right, it's happening now. Yeah, I won't be without going into examples. Without going into examples. So it's a disease. It's a mental disease. So the Sultan was opposed to anything that Herzl was trying to advance. Okay, I will. Yeah. So at least they will be able to listen here. Okay. So after excuse me. So after Herzl really failed, that's why they began to think about Uganda, because they couldn't really do anything in Palestine. So they began to think about Uganda. So basically what they did in the Zionist movement, after Uganda also was out of question, then they were bound just to speak. So what they tried to do was to recruit as many Jews as they could and to educate. Now that in itself became a big problem, because as long as they spoke about just founding a Jewish state, that was something that we can all unite behind. Herzl himself, while he had a very clear idea, just read his Tel Aviv, right? Is Altneuland. Thank you, Altneuland. Then you would see that he thought that the rabbis should basically stay in their shoes and not interrupt the work of the state. However, he said many times, if the Orthodox Jews would be the majority in the land, what he really is caring about, that there would be a Jewish state to which the Jews could run when they need. And if the Orthodox would run it, then fine, better than nothing. So he didn't really care. What he wanted was as many Jews coming to Eretz Israel as possible. However, most of the Zionist leadership was not of that mind. They were maskilim that 20 years before wanted to assimilate, and then they saw the program. That was your typical Zionist leader, or someone that was half assimilated, if not completely assimilated. I mean, not maybe married to a Jew, though some of them were also that, but extremely assimilated culturally. Some of them knew nothing. We have this myth about all of these first Zionists that landed in the Haderim, that may be 6 years before. But at the time, the point in time that we speak about, and most of them, I'm trying to find it then most of them were almost having no Jewish knowledge. In that, Herzl was, by the way, no different. He also had almost zero Jewish knowledge. But he, as I said, didn't see that as the ideal. But the other of the Zionist movement, they thought that that's how Jews should be. That's the new Jew. And so if they could not right now build the land, what they can do is build a new Jew. And that was what was called the cultural question. The Zionist movement took a decision that when it cannot work on building the future Jewish state, it would work on being the infrastructure by building Jewish schools, etc., which would be, of course, completely secular. And then the Mizrahi was put in front of a dilemma. Now, the Mizrahi was a very strong force. They were 25% of the Zionist Congress at their peak. 25%, that's a lot. But however, it's not the majority. And the majority accepted this program that what they should do from now on is culture, which was called the kultura, cultural work. So Jewish education, but not Jewish, Zionist education, secular education.
So
Now,
no more Torah. So it's interesting. Like, why did they think it was just Jew in name only?
no, it would be in Hebrew. It would be Hebrewized. It would be Hebrew culture. But also you can learn maybe Tanakh is very important. And you'd be directed to Eretz Israel. And you'd be educated to become a chalutz, a pioneer. But why to keep the Torah? Yes, exactly. It was culturally, it was nationally. That was what really was important. The element was important for them was the national element. And sometimes they would pay lip service because they wanted the children to come, they wanted the Jewish parents to send to them, so they would pay some lip service to religious elements, but it was hollow. And that's what it produced. We need to say it out. That was the problem, that the reason why so many Orthodox traditional rabbis resisted Zionism was because, and not because of Zionism itself, they didn't necessarily reject making Aliyah. But the problem was that the strongest element in the Zionist movement was completely secular. And that's, I think that's the things that are known to us all. What Rav Meir Bar Ilan declared was that the Mizrahi should not abandon the Zionist organization, but instead he said we should try and influence from within. As we can all understand, that's a decision that has maybe gains, but it also has prices. The Mizrahi fell from 25% to 13%. Many rabbis stopped sponsoring and assisting the Zionist movement, and the Mizrahi went into recess, decline. At that point, Rav Meir Bar Ilan decides that now it's the time to go to the new Jewish center. What was the new Jewish center? The United States of America. The United States of America. And so in 1913, he goes to the United States as a delegate of the Mizrahi. Now, he thought he would be there only for half a year or a year, but as we all know, in a few months, First World War breaks up. He goes back to Europe for a short time, collects his family, and they all run away to Europe because he is a Russian citizen. He cannot stay in Germany, and neither his family. So he doesn't want to return to Russia, which is not in a simple state. And so he runs west to the United States and stayed there till 1926. So for 13 years, in which he completely revolutionized the modern Orthodox world in the United States. And I had a very interesting hartza'ah, lecture from Adam Ferziger, who is an important professor in Bar Ilan, in the University of Bar Ilan, for American Jewry. And he asked a very interesting question. He said, how it came to be that in the United States, it's part of the DNA of modern Orthodoxy to be a Zionist. How it came to be? Because in Germany, the birthplace of modern Orthodoxy, they were far from Zionism. They were in opposition of Zionism in the modern Orthodoxy. How it came to be in the United States? A very interesting question. And he said many would answer because of Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, and he's called Dodi Dofek and other, and he said in part it is true, but a short historical review would reveal that Rav Yosef Soloveitchik himself only became a Zionist in the 50s after Second World War, and but YU was a very important institution before Rav Soloveitchik became Zionist. The modern Orthodoxy was very strong before, and in the joint, in others, the Mizrahi was extremely strong before Rav Soloveitchik became Mizrahi. As a matter of fact, before some Rav Kotler, which I hope to speak about Bezot Hashem in the coming weeks, but before they came from Eastern Europe to the United States, the Aguda did not exist in the United States. So how it came to be? And his answer is Meir Bar Ilan. Of Meir Bar Ilan for 13 years was going from shore to shore, from the east to the west, again and again, going throughout all of the Jewish centers and making, and convincing people, drawing them to the Mizrahi. And he created the first Mizrahi convention in Cincinnati, thank you, which was a reform stronghold. But he was able, and he wanted there in purpose, by intention, to do the Mizrahi convention. He has a beautiful description. He describes the first time he goes to the United States, and it's in a ship, right? No planes yet. And he describes that there are Jews there from Eastern Europe, and with a beard, and they look like Jews, Jewish Jews. And he sits next to them, and on the boat you can have kosher food and you can have non-kosher food. And they eat non-kosher. And he asks them how it comes to be. And they say to him, you know, America is a different place. America is America. And if we are already going there, then what is the difference 1 week here or there? And he understood that that's the mindset, that America is the Treif Medina, it's a different place, and no one is even trying to make a difference. He said, I am the one that has, again, and here we have to remember his inclination from young age, that the responsibility is his. There are people that live with that sense. I think most of us, we would stay eating kosher. Other people would stay eating no kosher. What can we do? Right? But that was not his personality. He would say, I am responsible that everyone should eat kosher. And of course, he couldn't change the mind of his fellow passengers on the boat, but he came down to the shore and he began to walk. And of course, he was not alone. We don't think that he single-handedly created the modern Orthodoxy in the United States. There are many, many other people that also should be credited. But he was a very strong force. Again, the son of the Nazi, we have to understand that his standing was very strong. He was a rabbi, he was a Torah, he was a Talmid Chacham, he was a man of words and a man of deeds, of actions, and he did miracles. Also, again, I didn't know that before I prepared this shiur. He was instrumental in the creation of YU as we know it today. The Yeshiva Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan was created before he came to the United States, but it was a yeshiva, an important yeshiva. When Dr. Revel was the head of Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, Dr. Revel was called for some family matter in the south, where his family was, and they asked Rav Meir Bar Ilan, who was a Talmid Chacham and the son of the Naziv, and also a man of, as I said, of fundraising, and he knew how to run an institution. They asked him to become the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of Ritz, of Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan. And he accepted and was there for 2 years. And when he was there, he combined Ritz with the Mizrahi institution for training teachers. Now, that may seem to you as something very minor, but it was not, because that was the infrastructure for all of the Limudei Chol, for all of the college. Because the Mizrahi institution was giving degrees, diplomas. So when he brings the teacher institution of Mizrahi into Ritz, what he really does is creating this two-headed institution that is a yeshiva, but also it was not a university and even not a college, but it's giving diplomas. And later, Dr. Revel came back and retook his position, but he didn't undo the merge. And so later, on this merge with the Mizrahi Institution for Teachers Training, the college was built, and later it became Yeshiva University as is known today. So in that sense, he had a very strong impact on the modern Jewish life in the United States. During World War I, he was also involved with the Joint. I mean, he was a man that everything that happens around him, he had a hand in. It's just amazing. I could, for the rest of this year, which should already end, I could give you the long list of his actions. In 1926, he decides that he had enough in the United States, and it's time again to complete the journey from Voložin to Yerushalayim, and he makes Aliyah. Now he makes Aliyah. He would continue to travel throughout the world, in South Africa, in many other places, but he sets his house in Yerushalayim, and there he is, just to give you again a short list, is Chaver Asefat HaNivcharim, is a member in the Vada Leumi, is a member in the board of Keren Kayemet LiYisrael, the JNF, he is the founder of Bank HaMizrahi. So he's a jack of all trades. That's he founded the newspaper Hatzofe and was the editor for 15 years. He founded Kerem Beyavne, the Yeshiva of Kerem Beyavne. Why in Yavne? Because he has this historical sense that we need to re-establish Torah in Eretz Israel. It should be where the historical Yeshiva of Kerem Beyavne. So he establishes the kibbutz of Yavne, and then in the kibbutz, he established the Yeshiva of Kerem Beyavne. With all of these deeds, he was always frustrated for not being able to accomplish everything that he wanted. So his students and friends published for his 60th birthday, they published a sefer with his articles, some of his articles, because he published many articles. And he writes in the introduction that he's happy for them giving him the kavod, but he's sad. Why? He wanted the articles to not be relevant anymore. He says, if you still need to republish my articles about chinuch, it means that we are still facing the same problems. And there is a sad tone to it, because he says, I don't want to burden you. You are young, so you are full of energy, but I am reading these articles that doesn't make me happy. It makes me gloomy. It makes me sad for not being able to realize everything that I wanted. He is a staunch opposer for תכנית החלוקה, the splitting of Eretz Israel that was proposed by the British. He was planning a civil revolt. He took his key from Mahatma Gandhi in India, and he crafted a whole program of civil revolt against the British. But when it came to be realized, Second World War broke. Of course, everything was immediately cancelled. And he, in the middle of World War II, when it was extremely dangerous to go in the seas, he is sailing again to the United States in order to participate in the famous walk in Washington for the bombing of Auschwitz. It was so important for him that he took the time and effort to go there, also to recruit money. In his last years, during the World War II, he also understood that there are a few Torah projects. In the end, he's the son of the Netziv. So he is the founder of Encyclopedia Talmudit. So the Talmudic Encyclopedia, here we have, I think, 30 of the volumes. It's still being, I think they are now in Nun. And so they began in Aleph 100 years ago, more or less. 80 years ago. And they are now in Nun. And he was the editor of the first two volumes. And the main force behind the foundation of the Encyclopedia Talmudit. Again, that's something that would something to celebrate for generations. Very important In a way, also, it's a continuation of his father, not only because it's Torah, but his father was known for, again, for breadth, from the attempt to arrange everything. And that's what encyclopedia is about. So that's a Talmudic encyclopedia. In 1984, he sees, of course, the establishment of Medinat Israel, which was a day of celebration for him. Excuse me, 48, of course. A day of celebration. He says, we see here, he says, if I would have seen our forefathers, if they would have walked out now of their graves, they would tell us that's the fulfillment of the words of the prophets. And we see it with our own eyes. What he was dealing with, now he became extremely sick in his last years, and he was fighting for Yerushalayim, because we have to remember that Yerushalayim is under siege during the Milchemet Ha'atzmaut in 48, and some voices in the new government call for maybe abandoning. It's too much for us. We should focus in Tel Aviv and the colonies around it and abandon Yerushalayim. And this says abandoning Yerushalayim is like abandoning a body abandons our head in order to save his stomach. You must keep your head on. And as we know, his opinion was, again, he was not the only one saying that. David Ben-Gurion also, I think, understood the same thing. But he was a very important voice. He risked his life while he was very sick just to go from Yerushalayim to Tel Aviv during the siege to speak with the members of the temporary government. And in the end, he passes in the final stages of Milchemet Ha'atzmaut, Yutet Benisan Tafshintet, the 70th of April, 1949. He was not, they couldn't bury him in Har HaZeitim because it was already under Jordanian control. So they buried him first in a temporary burial place, and later he was moved to Sanhedria. And there is a Mizrahi plot there. So he's buried there. And throughout all of his life, I want to end with what we began with. He desired to create this wholeness of Torah in the land. Even changed his name from Berlin, didn't want to be named after a non-Jewish city, to Bar Ilan, the son of the big tree. That is his father, Anatziv. So Bar Ilan. And he saw himself as continuing this lineage and replanting it in Yerushalayim, in its real home. And he said, a Jew that is a Zionist but not keep tradition, there is something wrong with Zionism, because what does it mean to be in Zion if we do not behave as Jews? But also he says a Jew that keeps Torah but does not understand that he needs to be in Eretz Israel, there is a problem with his Torah if he does not understand that his Torah should take its place in Eretz Israel. Very sharp words. And again, he's the one that he formulated what we know as this Torah, Am Israel, according to Torah Israel in Eretz Israel. Now, again, he didn't invent the concept, but he was the one to put it in this short form, in this formulation, and it's really reflective of his own life. He passed away, as I said, in 1949, and because it was during the war, and I think so many events happened, in a sense, he was not memorized, I think, in the proper way, as I began by saying. Universitat Bar Ilan was later established by Pinchas Hurgin, Professor Pinchas Hurgin, who was a student in Voložhin, knew him from Voložhin, and learned in YU, and then came to establish the university here with the money of the Mizrahi in the United States, and they wanted to name it after Rav Meir Bar Ilan. That's how Universitat Bar Ilan became to be named after him. And it's a great man that I think we can all benefit by learning more about. And I would recommend reading his memoir. It's not about himself at all. It's about things that he saw and people that he met. I think extremely recommended. I cannot recommend the Yiddish because I don't read Yiddish, but the Hebrew is excellent, and I'm sure the English is as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.